Welcome to episode 10 of the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide. I am one of your hosts, Candace Dellacona. Our other host, Jody Argentino, is not able to join us today, but great news. We have my friend, Eileen Spillane, and also the founder of an organization called Befriending Death, who is joining us today to talk about all things related to death and dying and how we can better understand and talk about the subject that so many people feel is a difficult one. So welcome, Eileen.
Thanks so much for having me, Candace. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, you too. So why don't you start by sharing with our audience a little bit about who you are and how you sort of got here, and then we'll talk about befriending death and what our listeners need to know.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a family that allowed us to see death up close and personal and really normalized it, at least from my mother's side of the perspective. My father wasn't as open about bringing conversations in around death and dying. But my mother came from a family, all of my grandparents are immigrants from Ireland, and my mother came from a family that really talked about death and dying. In fact, one of my grandmother's proposals from her sister was, "Will you share your grave with me?" Like, wow. Talk about romance, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, it was very alive in their family. And so we were exposed to a lot of death in our childhood. And my mom kind of, just really made that normal. We saw grieving, we saw open caskets. Then because my parents had a pretty limited viewpoint of what women should do, we were told to either be nurses or teachers if you were the girls in the family, and the boys would become cops or firemen. And I found myself working as a nurse very young, like as maybe 20 years old. It was part of my nursing school program. I found myself at Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, and I was working with patients who had brain tumors and spinal cord tumors and who were very sick.
Right.
I worked with incredible nurses who really took me under their wing. And when I graduated from Adelphi, which was back in 1990, I took a job at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center. And, I was young. I was maybe like 20, 21. And I was at times taking care of people who were my age. And that was just up close and personal in that way, where I think you can live thinking death is out there and death will come later on.
Right.
It was a real wake-up call for me in that, where it was like the Shawshank Redemption line of like, you better get busy living, otherwise you're getting busy dying. And I kind of just created this adventurous life and went off to work as a travel nurse in Hawaii and went scuba diving and skydiving and windsurfing and did triathlons. And it really had an informed way of impacting me personally and professionally in that very first job.
I mean, that's really interesting, Eileen, the way that it impacted you, in that here you were as this young professional here in New York City at, by the way, one of the best cancer hospitals in the world, arguably, right? And you're surrounded by very sick people, in some cases were the recipients of bad luck receiving cancer, or certain lifestyle choices related to smoking or whatever have you, resulted in facing these sort of dire health situations. And instead of having your world become smaller and allowing maybe the fear of the unknown to seep in, you did the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of remarkable, actually.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. And yeah, it continues to be the way I look at it. And as I've gone through my nursing career, and death was a big part of it, no matter where I worked, now that I'm doing work with Befriending Death, it's kind of like it just works on you without you even knowing it. I find that my life is still being impacted just by marinating in the topic of death and dying as I facilitate courses and book clubs and other things.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. For our listeners, Eileen and I have known each other quite a few years, and we had the occasion to have, I think, breakfast or lunch a few years ago when this idea was really coming to fruition for you, Eileen. And you saw sort of this dearth, right, in society for the opportunity maybe to have people talk about death or have it at least become part of the dialogue of living. And so can you tell us what exactly, if there was one incident or a series of incidents following your nursing career that made you find Befriending Death, and maybe talk about the ways in which you hope it will help people or you see it's helping people?
I'd say most of my motivation came from my years of working as a critical care nurse.
Right.
Some of it was at Sloan-Kettering, some of it was as a travel nurse working in different states. And over again, I saw that there was unnecessary suffering, that people were not having those conversations because they're hard conversations. We don't want to talk about death and dying. And so what was happening is they're now forced to make these life and choice decisions under duress, under high stress circumstances when in the neuroscience, like your amygdala is running the show, your center of fear, rather than your prefrontal cortex, where you have like this spaciousness and groundedness to make decisions from. But instead, you're put into this quick decision of like, do you want to be resuscitated, or do you want dialysis, or whatever the circumstances are? And most of the time, people don't have that conversation. Most of the time they say, oh, I just want to die in my sleep. I just want to go to sleep at night and not wake up in the morning and have a peaceful death at home. But that's not a plan.
Yes.
You know, a plan is like having someone appointed to be your healthcare proxy. It's knowing where your paperwork is. It's having conversations very early with your medical team, because physicians are not very good at initiating those conversations. They've been trained to heal you, to fix you.
Right. I think, to that point, Eileen, and for our listeners, we're going to provide your website on our resources page on Facebook. I'll put it on Instagram and on our firm page. But one of the things that you talked about in one of your blog articles, I think it was in relation to your dad's passing and how your mom wanted to give him what she called a beautiful death. And knowing your mom the way that I did, it sounds exactly like something that she'd say. She had this enormous heart and really had such a great spirit. And I think that most people wish that for their loved ones. But to your point about saying something like that and actually creating a plan and putting it into action, people don't know where to begin. Yeah. So as a nurse, you have kind of the inside scoop on what a plan would look like, whether there's a diagnosis of something or not. So could you tell us maybe what the first step should be with a loved one? Let's say you're diagnosed with an illness, or your loved one is, and it's a life-limiting type of illness. What is the best way to embark on that conversation of what a beautiful death may look like for someone, so that they're not in this urgent space of having to make these game time decisions in the way that you described, when everything is firing in your brain and probably not the most optimal way? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I would say the first thing you want to do is just pause and take a breath, because this is now devastating information. You're just living your normal life, and now you're dealt with this tough scenario. So not to rush into like, oh, I've got to get this signed and figure it all out. There's some space, there's some room. The communication is really important, because you want to bring compassion to the scenario, that this is devastating for all people involved. And I would just say to open up the conversation of what's important to you? Like what's important day to day in your life? What is a quality of life to you, me?
Right.
And that's different for everybody. Somebody just watching Seinfeld on the couch is a quality life, For somebody else, if they can't work, or if they have a disability, or if they can't speak, if they can't feed themselves, if they have to be in a skilled nursing facility, that's not a quality of life for some people, and for others it is.
You're so right. In fact, when we draft healthcare documents, aside from the healthcare proxy, we often draft a living will. And a living will is kind of an illustrious document. And one of my very favorite clients, and maybe he'll be listening to this episode, said to me, I just want use of one arm so that I can hold my grandchild. I thought that was such a beautiful sentiment, right? Where, what he said in that really brief sentence was, I don't have very high standards for what a fulfilling life is, where you and I may have a different definition. I think I shared with you, Eileen, years ago, I had a client who said to me, if you told me 20 years ago that I'd be happy with Thai takeout and a documentary on television, I would have told you were crazy. But now that I'm 80 years old and my husband has Parkinson's, that's a great night for me. And I think that's really important. So it's an ongoing dialogue too, isn't it?
It is. It is. And just as we're always changing, our views and our beliefs and our quality of life is going to shift and adapt as well.
Yeah.
And I just want to go back to you bringing in my father, because a lot of people have a tough time. How do I bring up this conversation when there might be some resistance? And so with both of my parents, and I've seen this across the board with patients, you have somebody who's really open to the conversation and somebody who's really resistant to the conversation.
Sure.
And my dad was one of those people that was very resistant. And he was a New York City firefighter. He ran into burning buildings his whole career. And death was very upfront and personal to him. But when it came to talking about it, he did not want to talk about it because he was superstitious and thought if we talk about it, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So time and time again, we would just gently navigate that. What would you want if your heart stopped? And I even got kind of clever because I brought in, when I was recertifying my advanced cardiac life support, I was with paramedics and firemen in the course, and I brought that conversation in and played a little dumb. Dad, how would this play out if you had to go to someone's house and they didn't have, the paperwork on their fridge and PULSE form or a DNR form? And he said the appropriate answer of well, we would have to resuscitate them. And so then I said, would you want that for you? He goes, Eileen, I don't want to talk about this.
So no matter what, he caught you.
You'd go over and over. And so eventually get to the point where you have to surrender what your own agenda is, because it's ultimately up to this person to make their decision. And in the end, he was able to go on hospice, and he did, in fact, have a really beautiful death at home in his bedroom.
Well, I think one of the things that you touched on too is, as an adult child, having a conversation like this with a parent. So in addition to talking about topics maybe that a parent isn't so keen to talk about, the interrelationships and the dynamics of a parent and child and the specific dynamics to a family can also play into it. So taking the breath, starting the conversation about what you'd want, and maybe trying to come at it at different angles, different ways is probably a good idea. Now, at what point do you bring in the care provider? I think my experience is similar to yours with my clients, that doctors either don't have the training, or there is sort of, and not for all, but for many, they go into medicine hoping to fix people. So it's almost incongruent for them to talk about death and dying, because that's the opposite of what they want to do for you. So when do you bring in the care provider, or the type of care provider? What type of care provider should you bring in to set up that plan?
Yeah. So number one, figure out who your doctors are. So if you're seeing a primary care doctor and you have a long-standing relationship with them, start with your first appointment. When you say, this is what my vision is as I'm aging, or even transfer your care to a gerontologist. A gerontologist is someone who's specializing in someone who's aging. So they're really tuned into reducing your medications, reducing the chance of you falling. They'll put hearing aids on for you to communicate. They actually look at you rather than the family member, which so often happens.
Such a little point, but it really is so important, right? Just
so important. You actually feel seen. You feel seen by your physician. And the thing is, physicians they're being run by the insurance industry. So they have very finite amount of time. And as we age and we become sick, we have so many more complicated things to cover in a 20-minute appointment or whatever's allotted for them.
Yeah.
So they don't actually have that much time to sit down and say, what are your wishes? So we have to drive that until we improve that on the medical.
Well, as someone who is an avid traveler and was a traveling nurse, do you notice big differences between cultures in the discussions around death? in the other countries and cultures you've been exposed to, maybe even your experiences at Memorial and treating patients from a different country. Are there stark differences?
Totally, totally. I mean, we're all coming from different races, different genders, different cultures, different religions. It has a huge impact. I just was in India in November and was in Varanasi, which is this very special place where when a death happens, the family, the men in the family literally carry the body through the village to the Ganges River. And so everyone is seeing it. Everyone is exposed to this. We don't see this in our country. Well, the only thing we see is like go into anti-aging. So you don't want it's all about celebrating our youthfulness. It's not talking about the death. So here they bring the body, they dunk the body in the Ganges, which is the sacred mother, the sacred river, and they have a funeral pyre right there. The ashes go back into the Ganges River. In Bali, I witnessed a cremation, and you literally see the body on fire. Like, it is not sheltered at all.
Wow.
Yeah, and so we don't really have that in our culture.
Yeah. I mean, we do, I guess in some ways, a wake might be considered something similar where a body is on display. But you're right, it's more sanitized, right? The job of the funeral home is to make the decedent look good and look as though they did when they were living, which is probably opposite of the purpose of that ceremony that you describe in India, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
Putting makeup on, you're beautifying it. And I feel like on the East Coast, there's even a cultural shift even in our country where
Interesting.
I've rarely seen an open casket on the West Coast, where, on the East Coast, I feel like it's a little bit more mainstream. And that may be influenced by because I grew up in a Catholic household where that was sort of the nature, where you had an open casket.
Yeah. Yeah. You might be onto something. I mean, all of those things are so interesting when you're talking about death and you're coming up with a plan. So Befriending Death has these sort of workshops, right? You call it Let's Chat About Death. So why don't we talk about what those workshops are and how they help people, and maybe what our listeners might gain from becoming a part of one of those workshops, those webinars.
Yeah. I'd say most people are motivated to do this course for their own selves or because they have a loved one who's aging or sick. Yep. And I've few people who've come in who are therapists and coaches or death doulas, sometimes financial planners, because you're dealing with people who, are aging or sick.
What's a death doula? I've never heard of that.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, it's an end-of-life doula who is trained as a non-medical person to be a support for the patient who's dying and their family and loved ones.
Interesting.
And it's so needed. Like just as in birth, sometimes they'll have a birth doula who's there as a non-medical support and maybe giving massage or back rubs and, guiding, and supporting pregnant mom. And with hospice, I don't know if you're that familiar with it, but oftentimes you feel like, oh, cool, I finally got hospice on board. And then you discover they're not at home with you on a regular basis. A hospice nurse that will come in, do a very thorough assessment and set you up and make sure your medications are set and you've got all the physical aids that you need. Sometimes you'll have a nursing assistant that comes in for a couple hours to maybe help with some bathing, but it's really on the family.
You're so right. I mean, just to interrupt you a little, Eileen, when my clients come in and there is a diagnosis, a life-limiting diagnosis, and as their disease progresses, there is such a disconnect between the information that's provided at the care level from, let's say, a discharge from a hospital or a rehab when somebody is discharged home through hospice, particularly if it's not inpatient hospice. There are so few inpatient hospice facilities here in New York City and on Long Island. There's only, I think, 2 between Kings County and all of Long Island that are just hospice facilities. So think about, it's so rare to be able to find a bed when you need it. And you're right that families think when they're going into hospice, they're going to have somebody with them sitting vigil, and they're not. Hospice is paid for by Medicare, so that all of our listeners know that, which is terrific. And it does entitle you to some nursing care, but it's sporadic. It is not sort of ongoing supportive care, which we call activities of daily living, or in this case, activities of dying, as it relates to the care that one receives at home while they are actively dying. And actively dying can take months, right? I mean, I guess in some ways we all are. So how does one find a death doula, though, Eileen?
Yeah, there is actually like a national registry for them, but
Really?
yeah, like I actually trained as a death doula myself just to enhance any non-medical learning that I had. And I did this through the Peaceful Presence Project in Oregon, which was really great. There's a TED Talk that your listeners could check out with Alua Arthur, who's incredible. She's incredible speaker on death and dying. So they're out there. There's a ton in New York.
So, when you talk about the course of let's chat about death, and let's say it's for your own edification, you're trying to support someone that you love. Can you tell us a little bit about what those webinars entail and maybe the format and what our listeners might be able to gain by attending them?
Yeah. I'm just going to add one thing about the hospice thing. Most people get to hospice too late. So just to put that out there, to start those conversations early. Some people are afraid because they're just like, is everyone just going to give up on me if I go hospice? I'm not going to have my treatment.
Sure.
Also something called palliative care, which can be reprioritizing comfort, but still hoping and trying to maintain your health as to the best as they can while keeping you comfortable.
That's a great distinction then. So there's a difference between palliative care and hospice, and people need to understand that palliative care means comfort plus a continuation of treatment, and hospice means the ceasing of treatment. Is that right?
Yes, it's a perfect example. And Jimmy Carter is a fantastic example of how you can go on hospice and you end up living so much longer than if you didn't go on hospice, because some of the treatments really injure us and, debilitate us. Sure. So when you optimize your living and you go on hospice, sometimes you're living way beyond the 6-month expectation. So
it was actually an article, I think, on that years ago, published by the New Yorker, and it talked about exactly your point, Eileen, which is hospice is started too late. Palliative care is generally started too late. And by and large, other than sort of outlying, I think, situations, people do tend to live longer because pain can hasten death.
Yes.
So that's really a really great point for our listeners. So, and I'll let you continue about let's chat about death. I keep interrupting.
Diverting. So so the course is broken up. It's a 6-session course over 12 weeks, and you have a little bit of homework that you do on your own. And the themes of the sessions, the first session is your own relationship to death. And you kind of just explore that in different exercises. We've got documentaries to watch. The second episode or the second session is about your relationship to aging, sickness, accidents, injuries, disabilities, the stuff that we don't want to think about that, as we age. The third session is for us to do our own inner exploration of, am I ready? Like, if I was to die tomorrow, is my paperwork in place? Do I have a durable power of attorney for healthcare? Do I have a power of attorney for finance, which is, your specialty? And then, do they know where to find those papers?
Sure.
And have I revisited it? Is it my ex-husband still on that, and I'm not with him anymore, whatever this
Right, yeah.
It's worth revisiting. And then we move on to, once we've done our own work, we can ask somebody else to do that work. So we might have a parent or grandparent or loved one, spouse, children, where we want them to do their own paperwork and find out what are their wishes? What are their wishes also after they die? What kind of burial do they want? There's a lot of new information about green burials. There's mushroom burial where you put a mushroom suit on. There's human composting. There's water aquamation. I mean, there's so much more than burial in a cemetery or cremation. And so you can have stimulating conversations about that. We talk about actually being with the dying, whether it's you yourself, if you're actively, going through a terminal diagnosis or being the support person for someone when they're actively dying, grieving, what's the grieving process like and how do we do that? And then the last session is really about letting death inform our living. And it's always the surprise for people because they think they're signing up for this serious, course where we're going to talk about the hard things about death and dying, but they end up really feeling inspired to live their lives in a much more intentional way.
I mean, it sounds like it summarizes your life and the way that it sort of came to you. It's almost full circle, isn't it?
It really is.
So in going through each of the episodes with the participants, what has been the most surprising reaction? Can you share with us any sort of anecdotal, maybe realizations or people that you'd never think maybe it could penetrate and the message really got through and it felt like such a win for your project?
Yeah, it's honestly, Candace, I'm often in tears at the end of a session because, at the end of a course, because I can see the resistance start to dissipate where people had panic attacks about the fear of dying, like they would literally like get short of breath when the idea came up, or they really dreaded, their mom had a horrible ICU death and they were just like, I've got to have this conversation with my father. I don't want him to relive this. And my siblings are not on the same page as me. And, to get that checked off the list was dramatic.
Yeah.
And she can just live her life. He can live his life and just not have that hanging over them.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a win, right? Because I think when you're losing to someone that you love, or if your life is coming to an end, perhaps in a way that you didn't anticipate or prematurely, we're never our best selves. I think the stress of it, the sadness, all the things that are wrapped up in it, it's so nice to have tools like yours to figure out a way to really tackle this topic that has been written about. There are songs about it, movies, art, everything you can think of, wars. And I think maybe it's a human reaction to try to avoid it. I really encounter that quite often in my practice where people say, well, we're finally ready to do our wills or our trusts or our healthcare directives. And what I try to do is have people feel empowered by having the conversation. There's not a lot of control that you have over how your life will end necessarily in terms of, what's going to happen to you, but there are certain things that you can take back the control of. And so to the extent that you can, whether it's appointing the right healthcare proxy to speak for you, or in your case, understanding the best way to start the conversation with a parent who might be resistant and dealing with a sibling who is equally resistant. I mean, I just think it's such a service to have this course, this series of courses to guide and usher people through the process.
Yeah, and it really is about putting power back into the patient here because, when we become a patient, which I have been many times in my life, we take your clothes away, we give you this flimsy little gown, people don't knock on the door when they come in, you have no autonomy. And so the least thing that we can do is give people the tools to ask the right questions, to appoint the right people, to know when they can say no, and just choose if allowing a natural death is something that gives you a sense of peace. Okay, let's make sure everyone knows that that's your wishes, particularly when people, as they are sick and aging, are losing things every single day. They're losing friends. As their friends die, they're losing their independence. Maybe they can't drive. And it's like, why not give them power back?
Absolutely. And the dignity of that, right? And really ensuring that everyone around that person recognizes that they are, in fact, a person, that they lived this beautiful, long life, hopefully, and that the end of it should be treated with tenderness and kindness and respect. And it should start with the person, him or herself or themselves. And I think it's just such an incredible movement that you've started, or you've harnessed. Maybe the movement is around us because death is something that's unavoidable for all of us. But I really am so happy and proud of you that you've created something that is so needed. As someone who is aging, I'm turning 50 this year. Certainly things have shifted a bit, and, our children are getting older, and I am thinking about my own mortality, having lost a parent and lost people quite important to me. So I'm so grateful for the resources that you're providing, Eileen, and I'm sure our listeners will equally find your website, which we will drop here in the chat, but it's, as you know, I've said it a couple of times, Befriending Death. And just the resources you've provided and the guidance are really so valuable. There's also a book club I'm seeing on the website.
Yeah. And the thing, I certainly did not start this movement. I just want to take that. But maybe I'm moving it along. Maybe
you're harnessing it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But I will say what is happening with Befriending Death is that there's a community piece, which is a little different than a one-way discussion out here. So it's gathering people so that they are having these intimate conversations together, which is really, it's a topic that most people avoid. So to find someone that you can go deep and have a conversation with this and get over the hump of whatever that is that you're afraid of is really, that's the piece that I think is the sweet spot, is having a community component to it.
Amazing. It's sort of a built-in support group to have this conversation. So like I said, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to hear more about your endeavor and really happy to share it all with our listeners. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on today. I know how busy you are and how much good work you're doing. So thank you for sharing your journey with us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having you. It's great to see you again and happy to be in conversation with you.
Terrific. Thank you.